Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Gretchen and today I'm here with a review for the book Night Watch by Jayne and Phillips. And this book is our 2024 Pulitzer Prize winner for fiction, and I have a lot of thoughts and a lot of things to say about this book. So I thought that I would do a full-length review because there is just so much to say. First of all, this book has been on my radar for a while. This book was longlisted for the 2023 National Book Award, and when I looked at that long list and I was reading all of the descriptions of the books that were longlisted, this one actually stood out for me. It sounded super interesting and one that I definitely wanted to see make it to the short list because it was one that I wanted to read. But when it didn't, I kind of lost track of it. I took it off my TBR cart and put it back on the shelf, and it was one of those books that I knew I would eventually get to, but surprisingly, it was chosen as the winner for this year's Pulitzer, so that made me think that yes, I definitely have to prioritize this book and get to it. I wasn't planning on reading this right away, although it did win the Pulitzer. I had other commitments, I had other books that I was more in the mood to read, so I kind of thought, you know what, I will get to it probably by the end of the year. But what propelled me to want to read this sooner is the fact that I have not, well, aside from it winning the Pulitzer and that judging panel deciding that this is the best piece of American fiction for 2024, I have not heard a single positive review about this book, and that really intrigued me, and I wanted to see what all of the hate was about, but also I wanted to be the one that actually had some positive things to say about it. I so wanted to like this book, and I kind of went into it with a open mind and a blank slate and with full intentions of trying to find the positives in this book and make me, as well as maybe some of those that didn't appreciate the book, why it won the Pulitzer. And sadly, I am just as disappointed in this book as everybody else. So yeah, there are several reasons, and I will get into detail with a lot of them. And the first thing that I'll do is just give a little bit of an overview of the book. This is a book that's tough to give too much of a overview for because you can easily get into spoiler territory. But this book basically, it starts with a journey on a little buckboard wagon, and we have three characters that are on that wagon, and it is Kona Lee, who is a little girl, her mother named Eliza, and then a man that goes by the name of Papa. And Papa is taking Kona Lee and Eliza to this asylum for lunatics. So Papa is very clearly not Kona Lee's actual father. We learn that very early, and he is taking Kona Lee and Eliza there. Eliza has been traumatized. She has some type of mental ailment. She appears to be suffering from some type of like post-traumatic stress, and Kona Lee is going with her, not as her daughter, as her caregiver. I'm not really sure why. She can't identify herself as her daughter, but she presents herself as the caregiver as opposed to her daughter. And then obviously too, one of the things we learn very early on is that Papa, as he goes by, he is a very terrible man, and he is the source of a lot of the trauma that Eliza and probably Connolly have gone through. And then once we kind of get to the asylum, we start to learn a little bit more about life in the asylum. We learn about a couple different characters. We learn about a man named the Night Watch. He is at the asylum, and then there's also a young boy at the asylum as well called Weed, and there is a man by the name of Dr. Story. So we learn about some new characters, and we get introduced to them in the timeline of the arrival of Eliza at the lunatic asylum. And then we kind of go back in time about 10 years in the past, I believe, and it's introducing us to two other characters, one named Derbla and the other that they refer to as the sharpshooter. So those are kind of the main characters that we are interested in, and we kind of go back and forth, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But you know, as we start to progress throughout the book, we learn how all of their lives, past and present characters, how their lives start to intertwine. And like I said, that's all I'll give as an overview, because you can very quickly get into spoilers. So kind of like I said, why I wanted to do this review is that it won the Pulitzer. So when I think of a Pulitzer Prize winning novel, I go into it having already very high expectations. The Pulitzer, when they are, obviously there are multiple categories for the Pulitzer, but for fiction specifically, what they are looking for, and I'm reading directly from this website, it says that they're looking for distinguished fiction published during the year by an American author, preferably dealing with American life. So the first thing that I will say about the book as far as criticism goes is, does it actually live up to what the Pulitzer was actually asking for? And to me, the only thing that this book actually lives up to is the fact that it was by an American author. To me, this book did not meet the criteria of being preferably dealing with American life. Now, although this book, and this is going to sound funny, although this book is set within the Civil War, toward the end of the Civil War, and then the aftermath of the Civil War, I don't really feel like it touched on American life or what it was like for Americans at that time. When I was reading this book, I was actually really surprised that there was very little at the end of the day to really be said about the Civil War. To me, the book just used the Civil War as a setting, an historical setting. It could officially be called historical fiction. And the other thing that it did was give an excuse for the Night Watch character injuries. So basically, you know, we have this man who was disfigured from the war, and he had these disfigurements, so you couldn't see or no longer tell who he was because of them. And the war was almost like a convenient excuse for that to be the case. And aside from that, like, I didn't feel like I learned anything about the Civil War. I don't feel like I learned anything about what it was like for the characters at the time, or Americans during the time. Now, yes, like, it was mentioned in passing some of the struggles that they would have, but I honestly don't think that, and this might be a very controversial thing to say, but I honestly think that you could take this book and almost use it as a template and insert other wars in it and still make it work the same way at the end of the book. You could take this and you could swap it with World War I, you could do it with World War II, you could even do it with Vietnam and just change the setting, change the characters, change the type of hospital. Like, you could do that with this book. It wasn't, to me, anything that screamed quintessential Civil War historical fiction. It didn't say anything special about the war for me, and as a matter of fact, it actually kind of made me mad as I was reading it, because I knew that it was set in the Civil War and none of the important topics related to the Civil War were coming up. There was nothing in there about slavery or racism or any of those things. The only thing that we knew was it was set during the years 1864 and I think 1874 is as far as it went. We heard a few things about rebel soldiers. We heard more about Union soldiers, but we didn't get into anything about what was really going on in America at that time. It was really just character focused and focusing on the struggles of those specific characters that really had nothing to do with what was going on with the war or why the war was going on. The only reason that the war impacted them was because they had a loved one that went to fight for the Union. That was really it. It had nothing to do with the fact that this was the Civil War. And as I started to think about it, I really started to get upset at the fact that this book, to be set in the Civil War, could have done a lot more to talk about those important things related to the Civil War, and it almost, having those being omitted was almost a disservice to any of those that were involved in the war at the time. So I think that that's kind of like my first criticism of the book, where we have a Pulitzer that really strives to make the book that they choose about American life and what it's like to be an American in the time that the book is set in. And I really don't think that this book met that mark. But that cannot be my only criticism, because it does clearly say that it is preferably dealing with American life. So it doesn't have to, but that is a preference. So if I had to say whether or not this book was chosen because it had to do with American life, my guess would be no, because I really didn't think personally that it really captured anything about American life. It really just focused on what was going on with those specific characters and not really what the pulse of the nation was like at that particular time. Now, the other thing about this book that was really upsetting to me is I went into it thinking that we were going to be touching on a lot of themes. So it did purport that it was going to be covering war and the tragedies of war and the aftermath of war. And like I already spoke on, I don't really think that it did that as part of the theme. It claimed that it was part of the theme, but I really don't think it delivered that. The other thing is that it made a big deal about how this book was set in a lunatic asylum. And I thought by reading that in the description that we were going to have a lot to say about the plight of women, their mental health during the time. We were going to learn a lot about that, not only mental health in general, but specifically trauma. And I really think we only scratched the surface on that. Yes, it was set in a lunatic asylum, but for a book set in a lunatic asylum, I figured we would be talking way more in depth and in detail about Eliza's condition, her treatments, and all of those different things. And I really think we only scratched the surface. And not only that, but I thought too, we would learn more about the treatment of trauma and how trauma was looked upon at that time. And we really didn't do that. And the author actually, instead of talking about how Eliza was progressing and dealing and healing from her trauma, she spent more time talking about the actual event that triggered the trauma, which was really upsetting because the depiction of the traumatic event was very graphic. And that actually leads me to my next criticism of the book, is that it was, I personally feel, unnecessarily graphic in its depiction of sexual violence and the trauma that Eliza suffered. Now, I am not saying that books are not allowed to have those types of scenes or events happen in them. Absolutely. They are often critical to the plot and the narrative, and I know that the author sometimes has to walk us through the specifics of what is actually happening to the character for us to fully empathize and understand what is going on with them. But there was no need for the level of detail in this event. The event actually occurred over several pages, and the other thing about it is that we already knew that the abuser's character, we already knew what he was capable of, and we already knew more subtly from earlier on in the book, prior to the event happening, what he was capable of and what a monster and horrible person he was. So the author already established that ahead of time, and we already knew what this person was capable of, and we already knew the evil in their heart, and we knew what their intentions were, but the author still felt it necessary to go into very specific detail of what was happening during that scene. We could have used our imaginations more as a reader. I think sometimes there is power in the unknown. And when I was reading this book, I started to read it as I was finishing up one of the books for the Women's Prize for Nonfiction shortlist called A Flat Place. And A Flat Place is, for those of you that don't know, it was a book about a woman who was coping with her complex post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. And throughout the entirety of that book, which was about her coping with her trauma, we never really truly got the full details of everything that happened to her. We got enough, but as a reader, she trusted us to use our imaginations without actually having to come out and say all of those terrible, awful things. And to me, as a reader of that book, I found that way more impactful to not know all the gory details of what happened to her and just let her give me what she felt comfortable giving to me as the abused. And I really appreciated it for that. Whereas this, it was just down your throat, pushing all of that goriness and just horribleness onto the reader, and it was very jarring, and it didn't change my mind about the man or the abuser. I had already had my mind made up about him from things that were happening earlier, and I already knew that that character had gone through things and he was the person that was responsible, but I just don't feel like it was really necessary. I just think that the author could have been a little more delicate in presenting that scene. Like I said, it was already established what this man was capable of. We already knew that he was a monster, and I don't think that going into that much detail and being that graphic about something was necessarily adding to the story or making us empathize more with the victim. We already understood her trauma. We knew why she was there. We knew what she had gone through, but it was much subtler, and we don't need, it's not our business to know all of those gory details. Now, the other thing that really kind of rubbed me the wrong way about this book was there were so many times when I actually had to suspend my disbelief, and there were so many times where there were these tiny little conveniences that occurred throughout the duration of the book. At first it was like, okay, like, yeah, that happened. Okay, yeah, it could happen once, like, you know, stranger things have happened. But then it got to the point where it was happening so often, and it got so annoying for me. And I would get to a section and be like, yeah, of course this was gonna happen. And I could almost see things coming before they happened, because they were just so ridiculous. So like, for example, all of the characters' problems and needs could be fixed with a conversation between one other person. So for example, I won't go into any specific details that happened within the book, because they would definitely give some spoilers away. So for example, like, say that you go to the bank and you're at the bank and you're moving some money around, and the teller asks you, may I ask, like, why are you moving your money around? And you have like a big life purchase coming up, and you say, oh yeah, like, I'm looking at this house that I want to buy. And then the teller is like, oh, well, which house are you looking at? And then you tell her, and the teller is like, oh my God, that was my parents' house and they're dead, and I'm actually the executor of their will, and I'm trying to sell that house you're trying to buy. And then you start to have that conversation, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is just an amazing coincidence. And then you say to the teller, well, I would love to stay and talk about this. I'll get back to you soon, but I'm actually late for a dermatologist appointment. I've got to get this mole removed. And then the teller is like, oh, well, wait, I just so happen to be a dermatologist as well, and my office is across the street, and we can pop on over, get your mole removed, and then we can go look at the house. It was... And I know that that sounds ridiculous, but it was that level of ridiculousness in some of these scenarios. And it's like, you go to one person and you have all these problems and things that you need to solve, and everything can be resolved by having one conversation with one single person. And it just got to the point where it was a little ridiculous and very unbelievable to me. And not only that, but there was such a level of high drama that was also associated with it as well. So there was nothing subtle about that part of the book and the interactions with the characters. Everything was just over the top and needlessly dramatic. The other thing about that is that not only did you have to suspend your disbelief for all that was happening, but everything fit together in a perfect little puzzle. And to me, that was just the most implausible thing in the world. You have this book that is set in the backdrop and the aftermath of the Civil War, where nothing was going right. Nothing was tidy, nothing was neat, everything was messy. And here you are with these random characters coming from all over the place, and everything fitting into these nice, neat little puzzles. It just didn't work, and I was actually starting to think that it was a little kitschy and it was a little campy in certain areas because of the overall ridiculousness of the conveniences that were happening throughout the book. So another thing that really got under my skin about this book were the timelines. So I thought that they were a mess, and it kind of threw off the whole pacing of the book. I mentioned earlier that parts of it took place during the war, and then other parts of it took place in the aftermath. So when we started the book, we were in the aftermath, and then we did go back a few times. And I feel like the author did that, like going back and forth. I think she did it because she was trying to get one over on the reader. She was trying to put this plot twist into the book, and she was using that timeline shift to surprise the reader or maybe throw them off or whatever. But I could see the book's conclusion coming from a mile away. It was so obvious, and I really felt let down that it was so ridiculously predictable. I don't think that mixing up the timeline at all added anything extra to the story, and I honestly think that this book could have been written in a linear narrative and it would have done the exact same thing, and it may have even actually done it a little better. There were so many instances where the shifting back and forth, like I was confused. I was wondering, like, why are we going back to this? We already know this. Like, why are we now going back into the past and talking about it? Like, it didn't really make sense. And like I said, I think sometimes the shifting of timelines can be a very good tool to use when developing your plot, especially if you want there to be twists and turns and things that are revealed at certain points in time. But I don't think that it added anything extra. And if I would have read everything sequentially from start to finish, I think I would have had the same level of satisfaction, and probably more if it had been written that way. And then not only that, but I also feel like there could have been characters that didn't even exist in this book, and I would have been perfectly okay with that. For example, there's a character by the name of Weed. Now, although I enjoyed reading about Weed, and there were parts of the book that I did enjoy that included him as part of the narrative, he was an unnecessary character. I don't really understand why or what he contributed to the book as being a character. I think that there were maybe small things, but what Weed brought to the book could have easily been brought to the book by another character that already existed. So I did feel like there was a lot of unnecessary characters in there. And then the last complaint that I will say about characters was, I feel like the author built up and portrayed her characters in a certain way, but ultimately the way that she built them, they didn't live up to their character strengths or their character descriptions that the author had outlined for them. And the one instance that I can think of is there's a character by the name of Derbla, and I think that the author wanted me to believe that Derbla was this strong and independent and tough woman that could stand on her own. She didn't need help from anybody, but there were times when her character acted really helpless, and she acted the complete opposite of that when she could have very easily stepped into that situation and came out on the other side of it for the better without or with minimal repercussions from it. And I just didn't understand the point of building up these characters and trying to convince the reader that this is what the characters were, these were their personalities, and this is what they represented, and then for them to just kind of take a 180 and do the complete opposite of what you would expect a character like that, how it was written, to do in certain situations. So I think it just made the book clunkier. It made me scratch my head and wonder, once again, like, does the writer even know or understand or believe her own characters that she's writing? And it just felt a little flimsy to me. So after all of those complaints and all of those negative points that I want to make about the book, there is a positive to take away from this book, and that is the fact that the writing is super impressive. You can certainly tell that Jayne Ann Phillips is talented, and she definitely has a way with words. However, I don't care how well you write. If your characters aren't developed, if you don't have strong characters, if you don't have solid plots, or both, preferably, your books are always going to fall flat. And she clearly has talent, and that is part of why this book infuriated me so much. How could someone with that level of talent write such an average commercial-esque piece of historical fiction? She has the capacity to write a book that could blow a reader away, and sadly she underperformed with this book in my opinion. So at the end of the day, when I think about whether or not this book deserved to win the Pulitzer Prize, absolutely not. I just don't see it being at that level. I can let a few things go and still find a lot of merits or understand why a certain book won a book prize that I maybe didn't like or agree with, but I just can't find that with this book, unfortunately. And I keep coming back to also the books, and I know that I shouldn't do it, but it's so hard to not compare this book to other books that were in contention. And the two that immediately come to the top of my head are The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride and Northwoods by Daniel Mason. Both of those books, they were superior books in my opinion, and not only that, but they did a better job of conveying the American life part of what the Pulitzer typically looks like. So that part, like looking at those books and thinking about those books getting overlooked, not even finalists, was really, I'm still kind of scratching my head over that. And I will say I have yet to read the other two finalists. I actually just picked up from the library Wednesday's Child by Yi-Yun Lee. This is a short story collection that was a finalist, and then the other book was Same Bed, Different Dream by Ed Park, I think. I haven't read those, so I definitely don't know if those two books maybe deserved it over Night Watch. I don't know, but listen, the joke is definitely on me. I am but a humble amateur book reviewer. I am certainly not Jayne Ann Phillips getting to cash a $15,000 check for winning the Pulitzer. But yeah, this year, definitely didn't hit the mark for me, and hopefully next year the Pulitzer will redeem and come back with us with a great book and once again instill my faith in the Pulitzer as a prestigious book prize and an honor whenever you see those labels put on books of fiction. So yeah, it was not a good year for the Pulitzer for me. I will let you know if I do finish or read the other two finalists, but sadly this one did not hit the mark for me. I am curious if any of you did read this book and have the complete opposite opinion. I'm really wanting to hear more positives about this book. Like I said, everything I have heard so far has been so negative. I really have yet to hear some of the positives, and I do like hearing the other side of the story. so that I can maybe pick up on things that I overlooked or see things from that other lens that I missed, and maybe I could be convinced to have a greater appreciation for Night Watch than I currently do. And also, Larkin Termite has been another book that Jayne and Phillips wrote that has been on my TBR for a while, and I'm curious if that book is worth reading, if any of you have read it. I'm a little leery to keep it on my TBR since I disliked Night Watch so much, but I would be open to hearing whether or not I should still continue to want to read that one. And until we read again, bye.